Good morning. Christ is in our midst. I'm Father Kevin Long of St. Elias Antioch Orthodox Church in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Today is Tuesday, July 7th, 2020, and here are the readings for today. The first reading is from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verses 23 through 29, and then chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Brethren, before faith came, we were confined under the law, kept under restraint until faith should be revealed, so that the law was our custodian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that faith has come, and we are no longer under a custodian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no better than a slave, though he is the owner of all the estate. But he is under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So with us, when we were children, we were slaves to the elemental spirits of the universe. But when the time had fully come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. Today's Gospel is the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 5, verses 24 through 34. At that time, a great crowd followed Jesus and thronged him. And there was a certain woman who had had a flow of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, and spent all that she had, was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard of the reports about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well." And immediately the hemorrhage ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you're asking who touched you." And he looked round about to see her who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done in her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." In the Orthodox Church today, we remember Kyriake, the Great Martyr, who lived at the time of the Emperor Diocletian, sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries. She lived with her parents, and they had a certain amount of money, and there was a magistrate who wished to get a hold of that certain amount of money, and also found that Kyriake was attractive, and so he figured that she would be a perfect person to marry his son. But she refused. Very much in keeping with the traditions of our faith, she chose that she wanted to remain a virgin for Christ, just as many before her, like St. Thecla and others. And so very similar things happened to her in her life. She was pursued, she was captured, she was tormented, she was even tortured, but yet none of those things caused her to renounce her faith, and certainly none of those things led her into a position where she did something that she did not wish to do. She remained faithful to Christ, and she managed to evade the attempts that they had. Nothing that they could do, either through torment or through promise of treasure, none of those things could dissuade her from what she saw as the most important thing, which was remaining faithful to Jesus Christ. It wasn't just in keeping her virginity. There was a time when she had been brutally assaulted and injured, and she sat in her cell, and while she sat in her cell, she had a vision of Christ, and he came and he healed her. And yet when they saw her the next morning, they thought that it was the pagan gods who healed her, so they told her that she had to go to the temple and offer sacrifices in gratitude to them for what they had done. And she refused to do so, remaining steadfastly faithful to Christ, wishing instead that the temple would collapse around those that worship the pagan gods. In her life, we see an example of someone who puts aside all of the things that the world has to offer. There are all sorts of temptations that come at us in all sorts of different ways. It could be through money, it could be through power, it could be through coercion. All of those things belong to the world. And there's nothing in those things that bring you closer to Christ. No amount of money will bring you closer to Christ. No amount of power will bring you closer. Instead, power will pull you away from Christ, because you'll begin to place yourself in the position of judge and emperor, and you won't give the proper credit to Christ. Even coercion. And I think this is the one thing that's more challenging for us to understand than any other that we have right now in our culture. It seems that whenever we want someone to do something, we try to coerce them to do it if we can't get them to do it of their own free will. We punish people because they don't come to liturgy, or we find other means to enforce that kind of, we try to use means of force to get them to do or to be compliant. And so when we think about who Christ is and we think about his nature, we see that he didn't do anything through coercion. He worked very hard with the disciples, but the disciples still had their own free will. In the end, Judas had the ability to say yes or to no to betray Christ. It's not that he had to do it, but he chose of his own free will. Peter likewise, when Peter denied Christ, he still came back and he still followed Christ. He still repented and he came to his senses, and he was seen as righteous ultimately, because in as many times as he denied Christ, he said that he loved Christ. And so there are always these examples that we see where coercion seems to be a part of it, but in reality is not. And ultimately, the one thing that we can see where coercion just absolutely does not work is in how Jesus chooses to save us by dying himself. He is the master of the universe. He created the universe. And yet he is willing to die on a cross so that death may be destroyed and so that we have the hope of everlasting life. These things come not through force, but through will, and through a will that is gentle and loving and forgiving. And so when we think about who we are as Christians, we do need to remember, as St. Paul says, there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no male nor female, there is no slave nor free. But we also know that the spirit of the Christian is one of kindness and gentleness, of love and of joy and of self-control, as we said yesterday in the epistle. And so we need to be mindful of these things, and we need to live into these things so that we don't apply the ways of the world to reach the ways of God. So may God bless you and keep you, and may the memory of Saint Kyriake stay aflame in our lives, that we too can choose to do the right things and to pursue Christ and not give in to the challenges that the world is throwing at us. May God bless you and your family always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Have a great day.